He never chased fame. He never chased belts. But somehow, Nate Diaz became one of the most iconic names in MMA history. A fighter born from the rough streets of Stockton, California, who brought that same raw energy into the cage. He didn't fight to be marketable. He fought to be real. From his days on The Ultimate Fighter to choking out Conor McGregor on 11 days' notice, Nate built a career on grit, blood, and an unshakable refusal to play the UFC's game. He flipped off opponents mid-fight, called out his own bosses, and walked away when the money wasn't right. Love him or hate him, you couldn't ignore him. This is the story of a man who never sold his soul, never backed down from a war, and turned defiance into legend. This is Nate Diaz, the anti-hero MMA didn't want, but the one it needed. Stockton, California, a city with a reputation as tough as the people who survive it. Poverty, gang violence, and a constant fight to get by were part of everyday life. For Nate Diaz, this wasn't a backdrop. It was the foundation. He wasn't born into privilege or opportunity. He was born into a fight. Nate grew up alongside his older brother, Nick Diaz, in a single-parent household. Their mother worked hard to keep food on the table, but money was always tight. The streets of Stockton had a way of pulling kids into trouble, and the Diaz brothers weren't immune. They weren't born athletes with Olympic-level facilities. They were kids running around in a world where toughness was survival. Nick found a way out first, or at least a way to channel that chaos. He started training in martial arts at Cesar Gracie's Jiu-Jitsu Academy in Lodi. Nate followed, not because he had dreams of fame, but because Nick told him to show up. And in Stockton, when your big brother tells you to do something, you do it. Training wasn't glamorous. The Diaz brothers biked for miles to get to the gym, sometimes with barely enough food in their stomachs. They weren't learning martial arts for Instagram highlights. They were learning because it was the only place they felt control. Nate gravitated toward jiu-jitsu early, finding a natural rhythm in its flow. But it wasn't just grappling. The gym became a second home. It gave him discipline, structure, and, maybe most importantly, a crew of people who believed in him. But even as a teenager, Nate's personality was fully formed. He wasn't there to smile for the cameras or play politics. He carried himself with a chip on his shoulder, not as an act, but because he had lived a life that taught him to be suspicious of everything and everyone. If someone disrespected him, he called it out. If someone tried to intimidate him, he bit back harder. Those Stockton roots would follow him everywhere, into the WEC, into the UFC, and into every press conference, and stare down. They made him resilient. They made him relentless. And they made him unapologetically Nate Diaz. Because no matter how bright the lights got later in his career, he'd always carry that Stockton mentality into the cage. Fight hard, fight anyone, and never take a backward step. In 2007, the UFC's reality show The Ultimate Fighter was a proving ground for hungry prospects. It wasn't just about fighting, it was about surviving weeks in a house full of opponents, cameras, and constant pressure. For Nate Diaz, it was the perfect storm. Season 5 featured some of the most talented lightweights ever assembled on the show. Nate walked in as the younger brother of Nick Diaz, who had already built a reputation as a scrappy, outspoken brawler in the UFC. Some fighters saw Nate as just Nick's little brother. That didn't last long. From his very first fight on the show, Nate made an impression. His boxing was sharp, his jiu-jitsu lethal, and his cardio bottomless. He'd fight the same in round 1 as he did in round 3, something that broke opponents who thought they could match his pace. But it wasn't just the physical side. Nate brought that Stockton attitude to the cage, talking mid-fight, taunting, and showing zero intimidation no matter who was in front of him. One by one, he cut through the competition. Even when hurt or put in bad positions, Nate stayed calm. Years of rolling with Nick and seasoned killers at Cesar Gracie's gym had made him comfortable in chaos. That composure paid off in the finale, where Nate faced Manny Gamburian. The fight was competitive until Manny injured his shoulder during a scramble, forcing a tap. Nate Diaz was crowned the Ultimate Fighter Season 5 champion. That win didn't just get him a UFC contract, it introduced him to the world. Fans got their first real look at Nate's unique mix of volume boxing, slick submissions, and in-your-face attitude. He wasn't just another young fighter. He was someone who made you feel like you were in a street fight, even inside the most professional cage in the world. But with that spotlight came friction. Nate didn't play the media game. He didn't give sound bites that promoters could package neatly. If he didn't like something, he said it. If he thought he was underpaid, he made it known. From day one, Nate Diaz wasn't trying to be the UFC's poster boy, he was trying to be himself, and that alone made him stand out. Winning The Ultimate Fighter got Nate into the UFC, but keeping his spot meant surviving against some of the toughest names in the lightweight division. Nate didn't just survive, he thrived. He rattled off wins with a mix of high-volume boxing and submissions that caught opponents off guard. The Diaz jiu-jitsu game wasn't about stalling, it was about hunting. Armbar, triangle, guillotine. If there was a limb exposed, Nate was going for it. His fights became fan favorites because they were never boring. Nate pushed the pace, talked trash mid-fight, and had a chin that could absorb shots most fighters couldn't. But despite the wins and the excitement, the UFC seemed reluctant to push him as a star. Why? Because Nate wouldn't play by their rules. The Diaz brothers had a history of clashing with UFC brass. They didn't do corporate smiles, didn't read scripted promos, and weren't afraid to call out the UFC for low pay. Nate was no different. Even in victory, he'd use his post-fight interviews to air grievances. The fans loved it. The UFC? Not so much. This tension came to a head in fights where Nate was matched against killers on short notice or paid less than fighters with half his name value. He kept taking the fights anyway, often against dangerous, high-ranked opponents when others turned them down. That anyone, anywhere attitude earned him respect among fighters and fans alike. But it also meant he took more damage and risk than someone being carefully managed. Still, Nate didn't care about protecting a perfect record. In his mind, fighting was fighting. If you were a real fighter, you showed up. That attitude built his cult following. He wasn't chasing a spotless career for the history books. He was chasing moments, wars, and the kind of respect you can't fake. The UFC might have seen him as a difficult employee, but the fans saw him as one of them, a fighter who worked for himself, not for the company line. And over the next few years, that reputation would set the stage for the biggest moments of his career, and the ones that would change the fight game forever. To watch Nate Diaz fight was to watch a street fight wrapped in jiu-jitsu technique. His approach wasn't about one-punch knockouts or fancy spinning kicks. It was about overwhelming you with volume, pressure, and mental warfare. Nate's boxing, honed under coach Richard Perez, was rooted in fundamentals: a stiff jab, crisp 1-2s, and a relentless pace. But what made it brutal was his delivery. He'd pepper opponents with shot after shot, never giving them a chance to breathe, all while talking to them, reminding them they were losing. And then there was the Stockton slap, a move that was part insult, part tactic. Smack an opponent in the face, throw them off their rhythm, then follow it up with a flurry. It was psychological warfare disguised as disrespect. For Nate, it wasn't personal, it was strategy. If you fought angry, you made mistakes. And mistakes against Nate often ended with you on the ground in a triangle choke. His jiu-jitsu was elite. Cesar Gracie, black belt, elite. Unlike many MMA fighters who used jiu-jitsu purely for defense, Nate was offensive. If a fight hit the mat, he wasn't stalling for the ref to stand it up. He was attacking. Armbars, guillotines, sweeps. Nate's ground game flowed naturally, as if he were in the academy rolling, not inside the octagon with the lights blinding down. But the most important weapon Nate carried into the cage wasn't physical, it was endurance. Stockton runs, triathlon training, and years of non-stop sparring had built a gas tank that seemed endless. Round 1 looked like round 3. Round 3 looked like round 5. Many opponents wilted under that pressure, not because they couldn't match his skill, but because they couldn't match his pace. Nate's fights felt personal because he made them personal. He'd step into the octagon with the same attitude he had on the streets of Stockton. No fear, no backing down, and no respect until it was earned. This authenticity, this refusal to play the game the corporate way, made him stand out in an era when many fighters molded their personalities to fit UFC marketing. Nate molded nothing. He was the fight. March 5th, 2016, UFC 196. Rafael dos Anjos was set to defend his lightweight title against Conor McGregor, the UFC's biggest star. When dos Anjos pulled out with an injury just 11 days before the fight, the UFC scrambled. They needed someone with the guts to step in against the sport's most dangerous trash talker. The phone rang in Stockton. Nate Diaz answered. Nate wasn't in camp. He wasn't training for a 5-round war, but he didn't hesitate. "I'll fight him," he told the UFC. It wasn't bravado. Nate had been calling out McGregor for years, demanding real fights, over money fights. This was both. From the first press conference, it was chaos. Conor unleashed his verbal artillery. Nate, in true Diaz fashion, cut through it with raw, unscripted retorts. "You're on steroids," he barked at Conor, setting off a viral moment. The tension was real. Two fighters who didn't fake their animosity. When fight night came, McGregor started strong, landing heavy left hands and pushing the pace. Nate absorbed it all, taking punches that would have dropped most fighters. But by the second round, the tide turned. McGregor's output slowed. Nate's didn't. A crisp 1-2 wobbled McGregor. Another combo had him backpedaling. Then came the famous moment. Nate cracked McGregor with punches. McGregor shot for a desperate takedown, and Nate stuffed it, quickly moving to mount. Seconds later, he locked in a rear naked choke. McGregor tapped. The arena exploded. Joe Rogan stepped in for the post-fight interview. Nate grabbed the mic and delivered the line that would define his career. "I'm not surprised, motherfuckers." The crowd roared. This wasn't just a win, this was a seismic shift. Nate Diaz had submitted the UFC's biggest star on short notice. He didn't just take McGregor's aura, he took his momentum. Overnight, Nate went from cult favorite to mainstream star, and he did it his way, without compromising who he was. The UFC wasn't about to let their golden goose stay beaten. Within weeks, the rematch was booked. UFC 202, August 20th, 2016. The stakes? Astronomical. McGregor's pride, Nate's new status. A rivalry that had already become one of the most personal in UFC history. The build-up was pure chaos. Press conferences devolved into shouting matches and bottle-throwing incidents. Both men knew this fight wasn't just about winning, it was about legacy. When the fight began, McGregor came in with adjustments. He attacked Nate's lead leg with brutal kicks, managing his energy better than in the first fight. The first 2 rounds belonged to McGregor, but like clockwork, Nate began to surge in round 3, walking McGregor down, landing combinations, and taunting him with open hands and nods. By rounds 4 and 5, both men were exhausted, but still throwing. The final bell rang after 25 minutes of war. No ground game this time, just a bloody, grueling, striking battle. The decision went to McGregor by majority, but Nate's stock didn't drop an inch. In fact, it rose. Fans and analysts alike agreed. This was one of the greatest fights in UFC history. The PPV numbers shattered records. Nate's name was now on the A-list of MMA. He wasn't just a fighter, he was an event. People tuned in not just to see if he'd win, but to see what he'd do. Would he shock the world again? Would he speak his mind on live TV? Would he throw the Stockton slap on the sport's biggest stage? The rematch cemented something bigger than a rivalry. It proved that Nate Diaz didn't need a belt to be one of the most valuable fighters in the UFC. He didn't need to be perfect, he just needed to be Nate Diaz. After the McGregor saga, Nate Diaz was one of the UFC's biggest names. But instead of riding that momentum into a string of fights, he did something few fighters at the top would dare. He sat out for nearly 3 years. Why? Because Nate Diaz wasn't chasing quantity, he was chasing respect. And to him, respect meant fair pay, fair matchups, and being treated like more than a pawn in the UFC's marketing game. He'd spent years fighting dangerous opponents for relatively low pay, while the UFC poured promotional resources into fighters they could control. Nate started speaking openly about fighter pay, a subject that was, at the time, still taboo in MMA. He called out the revenue splits, questioned why fighters didn't have collective bargaining power, and mocked the idea that you had to be grateful just to be in the UFC. To the promotion, this made him difficult. To fighters and fans, it made him real. His stance wasn't about contracts alone, it was about control. He refused to take fights that didn't interest him, even if it meant missing huge paydays. "I'm not fighting just to fight," he said in interviews. "I'm fighting for a reason. That reason could be money, legacy, or the opponent's name value. But it would never be just because the UFC told him to." This self-imposed exile only made his return more anticipated. Fans knew when Nate came back. It wouldn't be for a tune-up fight. It would be for something that mattered. And when he finally did step back into the octagon, it wasn't just a fight. It was a statement. Nate Diaz was in the driver's seat of his career, and he wasn't giving that wheel back to anyone. In August 2019, Nate Diaz returned at UFC 241 after a 3-year layoff, facing former champion Anthony Pettis. Many wondered if the time away would dull his sharpness. Instead, Nate walked Pettis down for 3 rounds, mixing boxing, clinch work, and relentless pace to earn a dominant decision win. The crowd erupted. Nate grabbed the mic and called out Jorge Masvidal for his next fight. That call-out led to one of the most unique events in UFC history, the creation of the BMF, Baddest Motherfucker title. It wasn't a real championship in the traditional sense, but it was perfect for Nate. It wasn't about ranking. It was about attitude, toughness, and the ability to put on a show. UFC 244 at Madison Square Garden became a spectacle. The Rock walked out with the custom belt. The crowd was electric, and the fight itself was vintage Nate. Constant pressure, volume striking, and grit. Masvidal found early success, landing heavy shots and opening cuts around Nate's eyes. By the end of round 3, the doctor stopped the fight due to those cuts, awarding Masvidal the win. The stoppage sparked debate. Many felt Nate could have rallied in the championship rounds. Despite the loss, Nate's stock didn't drop. If anything, the event cemented his place as one of the UFC's most bankable names. In the years that followed, Nate continued to take big fights. Leon Edwards, Tony Ferguson, always against dangerous opponents, never easy matchups. He didn't fight as often, but when he did, the spotlight followed. And even as he aged, even as younger fighters came up, Nate Diaz remained the same. A Stockton brawler with slick jiu-jitsu, a granite chin, and an unshakable refusal to be anything other than himself. Nate Diaz will likely never be remembered as the greatest fighter on paper. He never held a UFC title. His record is littered with wins and losses, but numbers were never the point. Nate's legacy is about authenticity. In an era when fighters were told to talk a certain way, dress a certain way, and sell fights with manufactured drama, Nate was unapologetically real. He didn't fake rivalries. He didn't sugarcoat his opinions. He smoked on stage, cursed in interviews, and walked out to the cage in plain black shorts when others were wrapped in sponsor logos. He gave fans wars, bloody, exhausting, unforgettable wars. And he gave other fighters a blueprint for taking control of their careers. Stand up for your worth, fight who you want, and don't be afraid to walk away when the terms aren't right. Even outside the UFC, Nate carried that same energy. He transitioned to boxing, headlining pay-per-view events against Jake Paul and teasing more combat sports ventures. Win or lose, the crowds still show up, not just for the fight, but for Nate. In the end, Nate Diaz's career is proof that you don't have to play the hero or the villain to be remembered. You just have to be yourself, relentlessly, stubbornly, unshakably. And for over 15 years, Nate Diaz has been exactly that. The Stockton kid who took his street fight into the biggest arenas in the world and never let the bright lights change him. He didn't need a belt. He didn't need a spotless record. He just needed a mic, a fight, and a reason. And that's why, long after he's gone from the cage, Nate Diaz will still be a name fans say with a smile. And maybe, just maybe, a Stockton slap. In the fight game, most careers are measured in belts, records, and rankings. But Nate Diaz built something harder to define and harder to erase. He fought the best, win or lose. He spoke his mind when silence would have been easier. He turned down money when the terms weren't right. And he did it all without changing who he was. For some, he'll always be the underdog who shocked Conor McGregor. For others, he's the embodiment of fighter freedom. A man who proved you can be both a crowd favorite and a thorn in the UFC's side. But for every fan who's cheered him on, Nate Diaz is a reminder that greatness isn't always about the scoreboard. Sometimes it's about the story. From the streets of Stockton to the main events of Madison Square Garden, Nate carried that same street-born fire into every fight. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't ask for approval. And that's why his name will echo long after his gloves are hung up. Because some fighters are champions, but only a few, like Nate Diaz, become legends without ever needing a crown.